Good Jew, Bad Jew is a book by author and political analyst Professor Steven Friedman, which seeks to explore why the West views brutality against Ukrainians and Palestinians differently. Professor Friedman's critique examines what the current language around anti-Semitism in Israel implies for the fight against racism in South Africa and India and in other parts of the world. And he joins us for more on the book. Professor Friedman, it's great to speak to you. Now, your book draws parallels between the Nazi atrocities against Jews and violence perpetrated against the colonized peoples. How do you respond to critics who may argue that equating these historical events oversimplifies complex dynamics and it diminishes the unique suffering experienced by each of these groups?
Well, good afternoon, Hugo. No, I don't think that that's valid at all. I mean, you can draw comparisons, as I do, you can draw links between the German genocide of the Nama and Herero people in Namibia and the genocide perpetrated on the Jews of Europe, and you can show the common links between them. And that doesn't deny the suffering of anybody who was a victim of that genocide. And if we're going to make sense of our history, we need to make those comparisons, because one of the points I make in the book is that whereas the genocide perpetrated on the Jews of Europe was rightly greeted with absolute horror in Europe, as it should have been, the genocide of the Nama and Herero people were not greeted with horror. Many of the techniques and the tactics which were used to persecute Jews by the Nazis were actually developed in Namibia and refined in Namibia, and the West showed absolutely no interest in what was being done to the Herero and the Nama people. So, we use these examples to make points about current issues, and I don't think it minimizes anybody's suffering at all.
Professor Friedman, there are obvious biases indicated by the analogies or the examples that you've given. Why do those biases exist, and what are some of those biases?
Are you talking about the biases in Western attitude?
Yes, and in terms of interpretation of what is genocide in one country or one nation is not in another when the circumstances are very similar.
Well, absolutely. Because one of the things I do in my book is the book was partly inspired by a book by Professor Mahmoud Mamdani called Good Muslim, Bad Muslim. And one of the points that Mamdani makes in the book, which I mentioned in my book, is that in the minds of the people who run Europe, there have always been two kinds of wars, what he calls civilized wars and colonial wars. And the civilized wars, all this is inverted commas, are those wars between Western Europeans. And those wars are governed by law. You can't attack civilians, you can't attack hospitals, you can't attack schools. Whereas when they're colonial wars, then no law applies at all. You can do what you like, as has happened repeatedly. So it's really, to be blunt about it, it's a very old-fashioned form of racism, that what matters to Western Europeans and what Western Europeans are entitled to is not what everybody else is entitled to. And of course we saw this very clearly in the beginnings of the Ukraine war, in which we were told quite rightly that the Russians had no business bombing the Ukrainians. But of course the Israelis are entitled to bomb the Palestinians. And indeed, Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, before he bombed Ukraine, had bombed Syria. And there wasn't an outcry about that because, the Syrians are not white Europeans. So, it's a very ingrained attitude in Europe that Europeans are entitled to certain rights, but those rights don't necessarily extend to the rest of the human race.
Now, your book explores the use of the Holocaust memory and narratives by the Israeli state to justify its actions against Palestinians. How do you navigate the sensitivity of the Holocaust remembrance while also critiquing its instrumentalization in contemporary political discourse?
Well, I start from a basis which I think is very important to dealing with the sensitivity, that the Nazi genocide was an unspeakable crime. that any discrimination against Jewish people is as unacceptable as discrimination against any other people, and that racism is a scourge which we have to address. So I'm not minimizing the effect of the Nazi genocide at all. In fact, one of the arguments I make in the book is that the people who are actually minimizing the Nazi genocide are people on the other side of the argument, people who use it as an excuse for war crimes today. Because if you look at the history, the Zionist movement, which is the movement which gave birth to the current state of Israel, was initially not particularly worried about the Nazi genocide. They believed that the victims of the Nazi genocide were people who'd not protected themselves adequately, who'd allowed the Nazis to do what they liked to them, and they would show that that was the wrong way of going about it. And it was only much later, when it was politically convenient to them, that they then trotted it out and misused it. And one of the ways they misuse it today is we have this rather offensive site of, there's a monument in the state of Israel called Yad Vashem, which is a monument to the victims of the Nazi genocide. And it's become customary for some very dubious politicians who have themselves partly defended what the Nazis did, to trot over to the state of Israel and go to this memorial and pretend to be upset. Jair Bolsonaro, the former president of Brazil, went there. He's on record as saying that the Jews didn't die, the Nazis didn't kill the Jews, they died of starvation and cold, which was nobody's fault. Viktor Orban, the prime minister of Hungary, goes there, and he conducts campaigns against Jewish public figures in his own country. So it's really not my side of the argument which is showing disrespect to what was done to people. It's the other side of the argument.
So let's talk about how your book discusses how media portrays political rhetoric and shapes public perceptions of conflicts, because media has been critical, particularly in the current situation that we are witnessing between Israel and the state of Gaza, and that you watch or you listen to one media house, and the portrayal is on the one end of the stratum, and another media house reporting on the very same activities is on another end of the spectrum.
Well, indeed. Look, that's not uncommon in media, and that's not a problem if media have different perspectives. What is a problem is when media distort reality or refuse to report on reality because of their biases, so that you have a situation in which the type of, just for example, get back to the example of Ukraine again. The Western media in particular were filled with sympathy for Ukrainians and interviewing Ukrainian refugees and highlighting the bombings of Ukrainian cities, as of course they should have. But they showed absolutely no interest in what was happening to Palestinians. Whatever may have happened on October the 7th, it followed 16 years of a blockade of Gaza by the Israeli army, in which it was very difficult for people to make ends meet because if their entire movement was controlled. Some people have described it as the biggest open-air prison in the world. And none of that was even noticed by the media in North America and Western Europe. And then suddenly you have this event on October the 7th, which many consumers of media in those countries would believe was totally unprovoked, because the behavior which had provoked it was never reported. So you get a very distorted view. I don't think that we should expect media to be neutral, because human beings are not neutral. What we should expect media to be is accurate and fair. And it's not accurate to ignore the fact that, for example, however awful the violence may have been, that it followed 16 years of a blockade. If you don't report on that reality, then you're not giving your viewers or your listeners an adequate account of what happened.
Professor Friedman, we must talk about the lessons learned. Now, Rwanda is currently commemorating 30 years since that country's genocide. And in an article that I was reading, there was a general who had intelligence that there was an impending genocide on the cards a few weeks or days before it transpired, and he was not given the go-ahead to attempt to stop it. And before you know it, over 100 days, 800,000 people had been killed. And now, 30 years later, we're commemorating some of these activities that we could have stopped. So let's talk about those lessons. What are the lessons that we are learning from this?
Hugo, the tragedy is that the people who make decisions in the world aren't learning any lessons at all. I wish they were learning lessons. And the Rwanda commemoration is a very clear example of what I'm talking about. So what we have this very day as we're talking is a ceremony in Rwanda attended by various high-ups, including former President Clinton and senior EU people, etc. And what they're doing is that they're looking into cameras and pontificating about how they should never have let the genocide in Rwanda happen. Well, of course they should never have let the genocide in Rwanda happen, but why are they letting the genocide in Gaza happen? The same people who are making these statements about how we must learn the lessons of the way in which the people of Rwanda would miserably fail, are now miserably failing people elsewhere. And the sad reality is that if it happened in Rwanda again tomorrow, they'd let down the Rwanda people again. So it becomes, a sense that they've learned how to recite the slogans, people like Clinton and the EU people, etc., but they haven't learned the lessons of their own inactions. It's been pretty demonstrated that there was a great deal that Western powers could have done to prevent the Rwanda genocide. They didn't lift a finger, and they're doing exactly the same thing in Gaza. The only difference is that in Gaza, they're actually providing the weapons which enable the genocide to continue.
I mean, you speak of pontification. It's almost like they're sanitizing or washing their hands of those genocide and their responsibilities by attending these various events and talking about, well, this is what we could have done. And as you say, none of that is actually being done. But let's talk to what some of the key takeaways are from your publication. What are you hoping that the readers of this book will walk away with?
Okay, look, there are two answers to that question. The first one deals with the question of Jewish people in particular and what's happening in Palestine, etc. And what I want people to walk away with is the idea that we constantly hear that people who sympathize with the Palestinian people are bigoted against Jews, or the term is anti-Semitic, that this is a lie. And it's a lie not only because it wasn't anti-white to be anti-apartheid. It's a lie because if you actually look at and I mentioned this in relation to the Nazi genocide. If you have a look at some of the attitudes of the people who are running the Israeli state, they're more hostile to Jewish people than the people who supported the Palestinians are. So this idea that when you support the human rights of an oppressed group, you are actually a racist is something which we need to counter. But the second one is that it has a wider implication, and I deal with this in the last two chapters of the book. Because in our own country and in various places around the world, it has become very common for people who are opposing racists to get labeled as racists themselves. So that in South Africa, you hear this phrase, playing the race card, whenever a black person suggests that we're not an entirely racially equal society yet, which we clearly aren't. It all started in the US in the 1970s. In which white men who couldn't get into medical schools would go to court and say they'd been discriminated against because their places had been given to black people. And it's unfortunately very common in the world at the moment. I mean, we see it happening in Europe where people want to call for reparations for slavery or to remove the statues of slave owners, that people are continually told that they're anti-white or they're anti-European. That's not true. And it silences people who are opposed to racism. Racism is a huge problem in the world today, and we have no business silencing those people who rightly want to fight it.